I only met my great-grandma Cheva one time. She didn't speak English. We went to New York to visit her when I was about 7 years old. This is a picture of my mom and my great-grandma Cheva and my little sister Emily and me. I'm the one that's making a goofy face. I thought it was cute back then. My mom knew a few phrases in Spanish, and she taught them to us on the way. Hola, abuela Cheva, we would say when we would meet her. This is my grandpa Danny. This is my mom's father, my grandma Cheva's son. Didn't really know him much growing up. He came around for weddings and graduations, and I can only assume that he speaks Spanish and English. But I've never heard him speak Spanish. Somehow, between my great-grandma Cheva, who only spoke Spanish, to my mother, who only speaks English, we have lost an entire language. I've always been fascinated with everything to do with the Hispanic culture and language. And I think part of that stems from the fact that I feel a sense of loss at not knowing that language myself. I'm learning the language, but I'm not a native speaker, and I still have a long way to go. Because of my interest in this subject, I have chosen to study messages affecting Spanish language shift and vitality and the Hispanic response to that. According to Blanco, Tokaymaza, Hatch, and Garcia 2011, there are over 40 million Spanish-speaking residents in the United States. In the past, the people who would come over from Latin American countries and other countries would assimilate by putting aside their old culture and their own language, and they would adopt a new language, and they would learn English. They would become American. Today, we're seeing a different pattern emerge. We're seeing people that are becoming bilingual, and they are still retaining their original language while learning to function in English. There are many reasons that studying this topic is important. Obviously, it's a big political issue nowadays. You see things like Arizona and the different laws that they have, and there's just a really big tension between people groups right now. So the biggest reason that I see for studying this topic is just to understand each other and to bring people together and have less racial tension. The theory that I'm going to be going off of in this paper is called communication accommodation theory, and this is from Giles, and he says that this theory states that people are motivated to adjust their speech styles or accommodate as a means of expressing values, attitudes, and attention towards others. So like if you're with somebody that you like and you want them to like you and you approve of them, then you might adapt your style of speaking to the way that they're speaking. And on the flip side of that, if you don't approve of them and you don't accept their values, then you refuse to accommodate and you continue to speak in your own speech patterns. In reviewing the previous research on this subject, I found a term called language vitality, which is by Giles, Burness, and Taylor, 1977. Language vitality is the symbolic perception of the power and strength of a particular language. And when a language reaches a higher level, then there's a perception it changes the balance of power. And there's two socio-cultural factors that contribute to this language vitality: the critical mass effect and the linguistic landscape. The critical mass effect, by Linton 2004, is the sheer amount of people that speak that language in a certain space, in a certain context. When you have a lot of Hispanics that are speaking Spanish together, that increases the critical mass effect, and people are more likely to continue to use their language when there are other people around them doing the same thing. The linguistic landscape, by Landry and Burness, 1977, talks about the language that they see around them in, like on billboards, on TV, and commercials, and when you see signs like the picture that I put on this slide that are written in Spanish in your everyday community, it increases the amount of language vitality that the Spanish language has, and it can change that balance of power. Suddenly, Spanish speaking is not so oppressed anymore. It's coming out in the open. The literature review also talked about messages that were sent from schools, families, and communities, and how they influenced Latinos. There was A study by Butler and Gutierrez, 2003, about children of immigrants who were learning English in their school. And when they received positive messages from their peers and from teachers regarding Spanish speaking, it actually increased their ability to learn English. In the family context, we also reviewed a study by Butler and Gutierrez that showed, 2003 also, that showed that kids that have parents that read to them in both English and Spanish also increase their ability to learn English, and they continue to retain their Spanish as well. I also examined negative messages regarding Spanish speaking, and the big one on this is the English only movement. And this comes actually as a response to Spanish vitality, because there's a lot of people that are threatened by all the Spanish that they see cropping up everywhere on billboards. And they say, well, if they're here, they should speak the language. So there's an actual movement out there, a push to try to get schools and everything to only teach English, so that all these people that are coming in from other countries will stop speaking Spanish because it confuses them and threatens them, and switch over to the use of English. The problem with that is that when kids are taught in schools, when they're only taught in English, a lot of times that they fall behind and there's struggles, and the negative messages from peers causes them to decrease their self-esteem, and it it has the opposite effect of what the English only movement wants. They actually have a harder time learning English when they receive negative comments from their peers and the top-down policies that promote English only. Another effect it's had is from Latinos who are receiving these kinds of negative messages is for them to resist assimilation. And there's actually schools of thought out there, such as Garcia in 1983, that promote Hispanics setting themselves apart as a unique group and retaining their English language or their Spanish language, and setting up their own schools and instructing their kids the way that they want to, saying we are Hispanic, we're proud of that, and we're not going to assimilate and become American. According to the communication accommodation theory, CAT, some Latinos, they choose to change to accommodate to the U.S. culture by adopting English and setting aside their Spanish. And then on the other extreme, there's people like Garcia who wanted to choose not to accommodate by refusing to assimilate. I was interested in studying the people who are in between, the bilinguals, bilingual adults that speak Spanish and English, and I was interested in seeing how CAT fit in with them. How did they choose to, why do they choose to speak in English? And here's my research questions for this. When do bilingual adults choose to speak in Spanish, and when do they speak in English? Research question 2, what are the reasons for their language choices? Research question number 3, what are their attitudes towards each language? And number 4, are these behaviors and attitudes influenced by messages received from Anglos? I decided to take a qualitative approach to the study, and I conducted an ethnography that lasted for 6 months. I had 6 primary adults. They were, some of them were in families, some of them lived alone, and I studied them and I studied their family units that they lived in at the time. To ensure the ethical treatments of subjects, I made sure to obtain permission from each one of them. I changed their names to protect their privacy, and I had each one of them go back and look at the results to make sure that they matched up with what they felt was true, so that I was getting an accurate representation of their attitudes and beliefs. I recruited these 6 adults with the method of networking. I started with somebody that I met at work, and I asked to be introduced to their friends and family, and through them I was able to collect 6 different families. 4 of the 6 were from Mexico, and the other 2, one was from Colombia and one was from Puerto Rico. And they range in age. Most of them were in their 20s or 30s, although I had one gentleman who was 69 years old and a 95-year-old woman. And all these people, some of them had families. 2 of them were married to Anglos, so I had quite a variety. I was trying to get the largest variety I could possible. I gathered my data through ethnography. I spent 1 month with each family. I lived with them. I went public places with them. I observed their interactions, and I took field notes. And then at the end of each month, I sat down with the primary adult that I had chosen and had an interview with them. And I asked them questions about their attitudes and beliefs and why they made different choices. And I recorded those, transcribed them, and then I coded them and grouped the different themes that emerged according to themes. And I'm going to show you on the next slide how that looked. Here's a graph I made with some of the demographic information of all my participants. their age, where they were born, who they live with, whether they're legal or not, why they immigrated, their fluency in English, just information like that. And then I also put some information about why they speak different languages and what their attitudes. And I coded these different words in color. For example, you can see Maria says that she's comfortable speaking Spanish, and so I highlighted that in yellow. And then over here, Hector, in his attitude, he mentions the word comfortable as well. He's more familiar with the Spanish language. So I noted that comfort seems to be a good reason why a lot of people want to speak their language. In the results section, I grouped my results together into two different sections, the Spanish section and the English section, and I examined the research questions, the first three of them, according to those groups. I noticed that for Spanish, that bilingual adults chose to speak Spanish mostly in their homes and in Spanish-speaking communities when they were speaking to each other. They mostly spoke Spanish for the reasons of communicating with each other, and also just to retain their knowledge of Spanish. I found that retaining their heritage was very important, especially among the younger Hispanics. Their attitudes towards the Spanish language were mixed. They were positive, they wanted to remember their heritage, and there were also negative. Some of the participants felt there was a stigma in speaking Spanish that they needed to overcome. I also examined when they chose to speak English, and most of them spoke English in public places. They go to the grocery store or to a restaurant, they would speak English, and most of them spoke English in their workplaces. Hector was the only one that spoke Spanish at his workplace because he worked in a Mexican restaurant in the kitchen, and all of his co-workers also spoke Spanish. They spoke English for two different reasons. One was to be successful. Many of them voiced that it was important to learn English in the United States in order to be successful in their jobs, and also just to communicate with other people that spoke English. They had different attitudes towards the English language. Some of them were proud of being able to speak English and being able to speak it well, and others viewed it more of as a necessary evil, that they didn't really want to learn English. They were maybe resentful of having to learn it, but they recognized that they needed to anyway. As I examined how bilinguals, how they responded to different messages from Anglos in making their decisions on whether to speak Spanish or English, I noticed there were negative messages and positive messages. With the negative messages, the resulting emotion seemed to be guilt, which would cause them to distance themselves from their heritage and actually speak English at home. There were two different subjects in my study, Daniel and Diego, that both felt that that Spanish caused them to have a stigma, and so they would speak English at home and they would speak Spanish only when necessary to communicate. On the other hand, the positive messages would give them the emotional response of pride in their heritage, and these particular individuals would embrace their heritage, and they felt that speaking Spanish was important. So they would speak Spanish at home, teach it to their children so that they could remember their heritage, and they would speak English only when necessary in public to communicate with others. There were a few limitations in my study. One was that I had a very small sample size. I only interviewed 6 families. If I'd had a larger sample, I could study more, get a more variety of viewpoints, and maybe a more accurate idea of how people's attitudes and beliefs are. I also had a limited variety of participants. I tried to go for a big variety, but out of all 6 of them, only 2 of my participants were not from Mexico. It would be neat to try other countries and see if if the same attitudes and beliefs emerge. Another limitation I had in my study were the age differences. 4 of those were in their 20s and 30s, and then I had one that was from a much older generation, 69, and then one that was even older than that, 95. And some of these attitudes and beliefs may have shifted throughout the years, and so my study was not able to really account for those differences. I concluded that the context in which the different languages are preferred, that they stem from the responses to the mixed messages that Hispanics have received from Anglos. There are the positive messages, such as the linguistic landscape that I reviewed in the literature review, and those legitimize the Hispanic speaking, but then there's the negative messages, such as the English-only movement, that discourage it, that they say, you're not welcome here unless you change, unless you assimilate and put aside your Spanish-speaking ways. These emotional responses, they can have, these negative messages are guilt and resentment towards the English language,
And the guilt will prompt them to learn English, even though they're already motivated to learn English for purposes of communicating with others. But there's also this resentment, especially among the younger generations that I had observed, that instead causes them to reject these messages and causes them to defend their ethnic heritage and take pride in that. When bilingual adults speak both English and Spanish, they're expressing both approval and disapproval of U.S. values and responding to these mixed messages that they're hearing in the United States culture. They accommodate in public places, and this accommodation expresses agreement with the value that English is important and that they should learn to speak it if they live here. But on the other hand, when they refuse to accommodate in their own homes and speak their own language, they are actually expressing a rejection of the value that they have to seize to be Hispanic, and if they want to become part of the United States. As for suggestions for future research, I think that there should be another study that explores the differences between generations. I'd like to see how the 95-year-old woman who didn't even feel like it was important to learn English, and then through the next generation, the 69-year-old man who completely assimilated, and he didn't use Spanish at all. And then you go down to the newer generations that I had 4 of them, and all of them felt that it was important to keep Spanish, but they learned English as well. Since my study was limited in that area, I would like to see some future research that really explore those differences to see if that could be a valid argument. Another suggestion for future research would be that other language groups, such as bilingual Asians, for example, to see what kind of issues and if the same issues would arise or if they would be different based on their attitudes and beliefs from the different political systems and cultures that they came from. I really enjoyed doing this research, even though the ethnography part of this was actually fictional. You may have recognized or guessed that the Eusebia, the 95-year-old woman that was in my study, that was my great-grandmother, and Daniel, the 69-year-old, even though I made him from Mexico instead of Puerto Rico, he was my grandfather. So I did use some elements of my family in my study, and I think it really helped me to understand why my great-grandmother only spoke Spanish, and why my grandfather only spoke English, and why I, as a result, have to learn it all from scratch. And I really, really do admire the younger generations of Hispanics for maintaining that heritage and passing it down to their children, because I think it's a very valuable thing and something that I wish that had been passed down to me. Thank you all for listening. It's been a really fun semester, and I hope you all enjoyed this presentation as much as I enjoyed making it.